The warm November air hung over Addis Ababa like a thin, shimmering curtain, carrying the scent of earth and fuel across the runway of Bole International Airport. It was November 23, 1996, a Saturday, and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 prepared for what should have been an uneventful journey to Nairobi, then onward to Brazzaville. The Boeing 767 stood quiet and dignified at the gate, its engine still, its windows reflecting the morning sun. Passengers boarded with the casual confidence that comes with routine travel, completely unaware that their flight would soon become one of the most unforgettable hijackings in aviation history. A tragedy written in the sky, driven not by mechanical failure, but by desperation and human error. Inside the cockpit, Captain Lulabat reviewed the pre-flight documents. A seasoned pilot with thousands of hours behind him, he carried an air of calm certainty, a man shaped by discipline and experience. His first officer, Jonas Makuria, young but skilled, worked beside him with a quiet focus. Their teamwork was smooth, practiced, wordless at times. Nothing in their preparation hinted that within hours they would be fighting not for altitude or fuel, but for their lives, the lives of their passengers, and the survival of the aircraft itself. When the cabin door closed, the flight attendants began their routine. Luggage settled into overhead bins. Seatbelts snapped. Children giggled. Businessmen opened newspapers. Couples leaned back, ready for a short hop across East Africa. At 8:09 a.m., Flight 961 pushed back from the gate and began taxiing toward the runway. And then, as the engines rumbled awake, 3 young men rose from their seats. Their faces were tense, their movements deliberate, their eyes frantic, burning with a mixture of fear and reckless determination. Each held a broken bottle wrapped in cloth, crude weapons, but dangerous enough in a pressurized cabin. Their voices rose sharply as they shouted, "This plane is hijacked! Take us to Australia!" Passengers froze. Silence cracked through the cabin like lightning. Flight attendants felt a surge of dread rise inside them. The hijackers stormed toward the cockpit, banging on the reinforced door. Back then, cockpit doors were not the impenetrable barriers they would later become. They opened with little more than force and authority. The captain had no choice. He allowed them in. The moment they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The cockpit, normally a place of logic, procedure, and calm, was now a chamber of fear. One of the hijackers pointed his broken bottle toward the captain. "Australia," he demanded. "Fly us to Australia or we blow up the plane." Captain Abate's heart tightened. Australia was impossibly far. The Boeing 767 did not have enough fuel. No aircraft on a short regional route carried anywhere near that amount. The captain tried to reason with them. "We cannot reach Australia," he said, steadily. "We don't have the fuel for such a distance." But the hijackers, young and intoxicated, some with alcohol, others with delusions, did not understand aviation. They believed the plane had unlimited range. They believed long-haul aircraft could go anywhere. They believed threatening the crew would make the impossible possible. Their ignorance became a weapon more dangerous than any bomb. The captain repeated the truth. "We cannot reach Australia. We must land." But the hijackers screamed over him. "No landing! Fly over the ocean! You cannot fool us!" Their leader, jittery and paranoid, accused the crew of lying. Every time the captain spoke of fuel limitations, the hijacker became more agitated. He believed the captain was trying to trick them, trying to land secretly, trying to hand them over to authorities. And so he repeated his threats, louder, closer, sharper. "Fly to Australia or we kill everyone!" With every minute, the situation worsened. The hijackers forced the crew to turn away from land. The aircraft banked slowly toward the east, toward open water. The passengers felt the shift, some understanding, most not. The cabin crew tried to calm them, whispering reassurance they themselves did not believe. The ocean below glistened like steel. The captain pleaded again. "We do not have the fuel. We cannot cross the Indian Ocean." But the hijackers refused to listen. The leader leaned forward, pointing the broken bottle directly at Captain Abate's eye, a tremor running through his hand. "You will fly until we say stop." The aircraft passed the Ethiopian coastline and drifted over the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean. For the first time in his flying career, Captain Abate felt truly helpless. He checked the fuel gauges again. The situation was dire. The hijackers were forcing them into a suicide flight. Still, the captain tried negotiating. "Let us refuel," he said. "If you truly want Australia, we must refuel." But their paranoia blocked reason. "No landing! You are lying!" The Boeing 767 continued eastward, engines humming steadily. But the fuel tanks were draining at a merciless rate. Hours passed. Fear thickened in the cabin like a fog. Passengers clutched each other, whispering prayers in languages that rose and blended into a haunting chorus. Some cried quietly. Others stared blankly at the seat in front of them, minds numb. Parents held onto their children as if their arms alone could shield them from fate. Flight attendants moved silently, exchanging glances that said everything. "We are running out of time." In the cockpit, the warning lights began their terrible dance. Fuel pressure, fuel imbalance, left tank low, right tank critical. The captain looked at the hijackers once more. "We have minutes left," he said. Minutes. But the hijackers laughed, convinced he was still lying. Minutes later, one of the engines coughed, then sputtered, then died. The hijackers jolted. "What happened? What did you do?" The captain calmly pointed to the gauge. "We are out of fuel. There is nothing left." Panic washed over the hijackers' faces. Their delusion collided with reality. They screamed, ordering him to restart the engine. But one cannot command a metal heart to beat without blood. The second engine began to fail. The aircraft, now a powerless glider, descended toward the endless ocean. Captain Abate made a decision that would become a legend in aviation. He would ditch the aircraft intentionally, skillfully, with every ounce of training he possessed. He tightened his harness. He steadied his breath. He whispered to himself, "Not today. Not without trying." The ocean grew closer. Sunlight glared against the waves. Passengers braced. The cabin crew shouted commands. The hijackers realized too late that they had doomed themselves and everyone else. Captain Abate angled the plane for a controlled ditching, but the hijackers lunged forward, grabbing the controls, pulling, screaming. The aircraft jolted violently. The captain fought them off, but the damage was done. The Boeing 767 hit the water in a massive spray of white foam. Metal crumpled. Wings snapped. Fuselage tore open. Water rushed in. Voices erupted in terror. The aircraft cartwheeled across the surface, breaking apart in front of stunned beachgoers who watched from the shores of the Comoros Islands. It was one of the most dramatic ditchings in aviation history. And this was only the beginning of the truth the world would soon learn. The moment the Boeing 767 slammed into the Indian Ocean, time seemed to split in two. For the passengers inside, the world became a violent blur of metal, water, and screams. For the people standing on the white sands of the Comoros Islands, the sight was impossible. An enormous aircraft skimming across the waves like a wounded creature, its wings slicing through water before snapping like fragile bones. Some screamed, some ran, others simply froze, unable to comprehend the enormity of what they were witnessing. The aircraft shattered upon impact. The fuselage skipped, bounced, twisted, and finally tore apart, sending jets of seawater and debris shooting upward. For a terrible moment, the churning ocean swallowed half the plane, as if dragging it into a grave. One wing struck the water first, causing the aircraft to cartwheel, a deadly motion that ripped the cabin open like paper. Dozens of passengers were thrown violently from their seats, some into the sea, others trapped within the collapsing interior. The hijackers, who believed they were moments away from landing in Australia, were thrown forward into the cockpit wall, instantly crushed by the violent deceleration. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted. Screams mixed with rushing water. Darkness flooded the aisles. Loose oxygen masks swung wildly. Seat cushions snapped off hinges. Passengers struggled to free themselves as icy seawater surged in, filling the aircraft with terrifying speed. Those seated near the break in the fuselage were swept out into the open ocean instantly. Some managed to cling to floating debris. Others disappeared beneath the foaming waves. But miraculously, impossibly, there were survivors. In the forward section of the fuselage, where the structure remained mostly intact after the first impact, several passengers fought their way to the broken openings. Flight attendants, drenched and bruised, guided them away from jagged metal edges. Captain Lul Abate, though injured and exhausted, also survived the crash. His first officer did not. The captain, coughing seawater, pulled himself out of the wreckage and began shouting commands. Even in the chaos, his training pushing him to save as many lives as he could. "Swim away from the airplane. Move! Move north! Follow the currents!" The tail section began sinking rapidly, dragging twisted sections of the fuselage down with it. Passengers were pulled underwater by a sudden suction of descending debris. Those who managed to surface gasped for air, fighting for their lives as sharp fragments of metal bobbed around them. On the beach, the crowds sprang into action. Fishermen grabbed their boats. Tourists waded into the water. Locals sprinted into the waves without hesitation. Dozens of people risked their lives to reach survivors, long before any official rescue team could mobilize. The Comorians had never trained for aviation disaster response, but on that day, instinct and humanity were enough to turn an island into a rescue force. Many survivors later said that if not for the locals, almost no one would have made it. Some fishermen pulled unconscious passengers onto their boats, performing CPR with trembling hands. Others dove below the surface again and again, searching the submerged wreckage for signs of life. Children formed human chains to help the rescued reach the shore. Women tore fabric from their dresses to wrap bleeding passengers. Meanwhile, in the water, the survivors clung desperately to whatever floated. Seat cushions, broken insulation, twisted pieces of fuselage. The ocean, however, was unforgiving. Currents tugged at bodies, drifting them slowly away from the crash zone. Waves slammed against passengers already weakened from the impact. Captain Abate helped pull people to floating debris. His voice, hoarse from shouting, refused to fade. Even when injured passengers grabbed onto him, pulling him under, he used every last ounce of strength to keep going. "Hold on! Don't let go! Help is coming!" But the cruel reality was unavoidable. Many passengers had not fastened their seatbelts. Many were struck by debris. Many were unable to swim. Many were still trapped inside the sinking fuselage. The ocean showed no mercy. Within minutes, the once floating wings vanished beneath the surface. Air, bubbles rose in violent bursts as the final compartments filled completely. Silence slowly replaced the chaos, broken only by the cries of survivors drifting into the distance. Back on shore, makeshift triage areas formed. Survivors were wrapped in blankets, laid on towels, given water, comfort, anything the islanders had. The airport on the island, small and basic, struggled to keep up. Authorities radioed for emergency medical teams from neighboring regions, but time was not kind. Internal injuries, drowning complications, and shock claimed more lives, even after the rescue. News spread across the world at lightning speed. Headlines read, "Ethiopian Airlines Flight crashes into ocean, hijacking confirmed." Pilot attempted ditching, passengers survive. One of the worst hijacking disasters in history. Families watched in horror from thousands of miles away, waiting for the names of survivors. The captain, heartbroken but alive, recounted the final minutes to investigators. They would not listen. I told them we had no fuel. I told them we would crash. They believed I was lying. They thought I was tricking them. We were helpless. His voice broke as he added, "They threatened my passengers. They forced us over water. They doomed the flight." The world began to understand the horrifying truth. Flight 961 had not been lost to mechanical failure. It had been lost to human delusion. The hijackers, armed with nothing but broken bottles, had overpowered logic, reason, and aviation limits, forcing the crew into an impossible situation. Their fantasy of reaching Australia became a death sentence for most of those on board. In total, of the 175 passengers and crew, only 50 survived. Yet, even in tragedy, something astonishing emerged. It became the most successful ditching of a wide-body jet in history, despite the hijackers interfering until the very last second. Captain Abate's skill, guiding a powerless aircraft toward the ocean with precision, became legendary. Aviation schools around the world studied the ditching as a masterclass in control, courage, and professionalism under unimaginable pressure. But the story of Flight 961 was far from over. What happened next, the investigation, the global reaction, the changes in aviation security, would transform the future of air travel forever. And above all, the world would learn just how fragile control can be when fear takes the cockpit. The waters of the Indian Ocean slowly calmed as the broken pieces of Flight 961 sank into their silent, deep grave. What just hours earlier had been a living aircraft, full of voices, dreams, excitement, and fear, was now a trail of floating debris, disappearing under the relentless pull of the sea. The survivors who washed ashore clung to life with trembling hands, some coughing seawater, others too weak to speak, all haunted by the images that would never fade. The Comoros Islands, usually quiet and untouched by such horrors, transformed overnight into the epicenter of a tragedy the world could not ignore. Ambulances, old rattling vehicles barely equipped for major emergencies, rushed up and down the coastline. Doctors and nurses, many with limited supplies, improvised as best they could. Locals continued to arrive, bringing blankets, food, prayer beads, and anything they believed might offer comfort. Yet nothing could ease the devastation. The world awakens to the horror. By midday, international news networks interrupted regular programming with the breaking story. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 hijacked, forced ditching at sea. Dozens dead, survivors found along beaches. Pilot claims hijackers ignored fuel warnings. Phone lines lit up across Africa, Europe, Australia, and North America. Families begged for information, names, survival lists, anything that could confirm hope or solidify despair. Airline offices were overwhelmed. Some relatives fainted upon hearing early reports. Others stared at television screens in disbelief, praying the camera wouldn't pan onto a body recognizable to them. Governments reacted swiftly. Aviation officials met behind closed doors. Hijacking, once seen as a nuisance, a negotiable crime, had escalated into mass murder. At the crash site, a haunting silence rescue teams approached the crash zone by boat, navigating through the slick of jet fuel and shattered fuselage. Pieces of the aircraft floated aimlessly. Insulation foam, seat cushions, food trays, torn safety cards, and children's toys that bobbed gently with the waves. Divers entered the water with heavy hearts, knowing what they were about to see would scar them forever. Inside the sunken sections of the fuselage, they found passengers still strapped to seats, trapped by seat belts they never had a chance to unbuckle. Others had drowned, after the impact stunned them unconscious. Some had been thrown violently against metal walls. The divers surfaced slowly, carrying report after report that weighed more heavily than the gear on their backs. Survivors speak. Stories that shook investigators. As survivors recovered on the island, investigators began interviewing them. The accounts were staggering. A narrative that portrayed the hijackers not as strategic terrorists, but as irrational, intoxicated, and deeply paranoid young men driven by delusion. One survivor described their behavior vividly. They thought the plane was like a car, that if you just keep going, you eventually reach Australia. They didn't believe anything the pilot said. They thought the fuel gauge was a lie. Another recounted, "When the captain said we were out of fuel, they laughed. They said he was trying to trick them into landing so the police could catch them." A flight attendant, still trembling, added, "One hijacker said, 'We know how pilots lie, keep flying.' They didn't understand the physics, the limits, anything." The captain's voice breaks the silence. Captain Lowell Abate, heavily bandaged and emotionally shattered, gave his first account to investigators with a quiet, exhausted tone. "They were drunk, unstable. They believed we could reach Australia with the fuel we had. I explained again and again. But they didn't comprehend distance, or limits, or responsibility." He paused, staring into space before whispering, "They forced us to fly toward the ocean. They pushed us to death." His voice cracked, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that he had done everything humanly possible to save his passengers. He added, "When the engines died, I told them it was over. When we lost all power, I told them again. They still didn't understand. It was like reasoning with a storm." The hijacker's identity reveals a tragic irony. Investigators soon identified the hijackers. They were young Ethiopians in their early 20s. Not trained militants, not extremists, not political operatives. Their goal was simply asylum, a hopeless attempt at escaping poverty, a dream distorted into madness, a fantasy of reaching Australia, because they believed it guaranteed freedom and a new life. Ironically, none of them had ever seen an airline fuel chart or understood that intercontinental flights required thousands of liters of fuel, meticulously planned for every mile. In their minds, a plane, infinite travel, fuel, irrelevant, pilot resistance, deceit. It was a fatal misunderstanding. Aviation experts deliver their verdict. When the final analysis began, aviation investigators pieced together a devastating chain of events. The plane had enough fuel for 2 short hops, not a transoceanic odyssey. The hijackers forced the pilots to fly low over the ocean to avoid radar, wasting even more fuel. The captain made multiple attempts to steer toward land, but each time the hijackers noticed and threatened him. As the engines flamed out, the captain prepared for the safest ditching possible. But the hijackers interfered even during descent, grabbing the controls and disrupting alignment. One wing struck the water at a steep angle, causing the cartwheel motion that tore the aircraft apart. Experts stated, had the captain been allowed to perform the ditching without interference, a majority of the passengers would have survived. This was the deepest tragedy of all. The hijackers, in their ignorance, destroyed their own chances of survival, and those of 125 innocent people. Global shock becomes global outrage. News networks condemned the hijackers as the most delusional in aviation history. Newspapers printed illustrations of the ditching. Governments demanded stronger anti-hijacking laws. Air travel tightened across the world. But beyond policy and outrage, something else began to emerge. A sense of awe at the captain's skill. Pilots across the world said the same thing. No one could have ditched better under those conditions. No pilot trains for a ditching interfered with by hijackers. He saved everyone he could. Captain Abate would soon become a global example of calm under impossible pressure. But the world still had one question. How could such a disaster be prevented ever again? That answer, and the sweeping reforms that followed, would define the legacy of Flight 961. The world watched closely as the investigation into Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 unfolded. The tragedy had shaken global aviation not only because of the violent ditching, but because the cause was something far more terrifying than mechanical failure. 3 untrained, intoxicated hijackers with zero understanding of aviation had commanded a modern aircraft into the ocean. This was not terrorism driven by ideology. This was not sabotage. This was ignorance with the power to kill. And the world needed answers. International aviation authorities take action. Within days, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, FAA and aviation boards across multiple continents began emergency meetings. Officials reviewed the transcripts, survivor statements, radar data, and cockpit reports. The hijacking exposed a fatal flaw in global air travel. Cockpit access was far too easy. Before 9/11, many planes had cockpit doors that were little more than wooden partitions. Hijackers could simply attack a crew member or threaten passengers, and the pilots had to comply. The tragedy of Flight 961 demonstrated vividly that once irrational hijackers entered a cockpit, the aircraft, and everyone on board, could be doomed. The first major reform took shape: reinforcement of cockpit doors. Governments mandated that cockpit doors must be stronger lockable from inside resistant to force designed to delay or prevent entry. It was the first step, years ahead of the sweeping post-9/11 changes that would later redefine aviation security forever. Hijacking was no longer a negotiation, it became a catastrophe. For decades, standard procedure during hijackings was cooperate, keep everyone calm, land the plane, negotiate. Flight 961 destroyed that philosophy. Aviation boards realized that pilots, even when cooperating, could not prevent disaster if hijackers had unrealistic expectations, like flying halfway across the world on limited fuel. This led to a new global policy. Pilots must never yield full operational control. Even in a hijacking situation, pilots must retain control of the aircraft, communicate coded distress messages, prioritize safety over demands, attempt landing as soon as safely possible. Captain Abate had tried all of this, but the hijackers' aggression prevented it. The heroism of the crew becomes public. When survivors were well enough to give detailed statements, one truth stood above the rest. The crew fought for their passengers until the very last. Second, flight attendants risked their own lives to protect passengers from the hijackers. Some shielded children during the crash. Others guided survivors through broken fuselage walls and floating debris. One survivor later said, "The flight attendants were angels. They never stopped helping. Even in the water, one of them pulled me out from under a seat cushion." Captain Abate's heroism became international news. Pilots worldwide praised his extraordinary ditching maneuver under catastrophic conditions. Aviation analysts said, without his skill, 0 people would have survived. Despite injuries, shock, and hijacker interference, he had maintained control long enough to ditch the jet closer to the island, giving survivors a chance. The emotional weight on survivors. For those who lived, the experience carved deep, lifelong scars. Many survivors suffered PTSD, nightmares of water rushing in, fear of flying. Survivors' guilt, flashbacks, triggered by waves, engines, or even seatbelts. One survivor recalled, "I saw people disappear underwater. Their hands, I still see their hands reaching toward me." Another said, "The sound of the fuselage breaking. It follows me everywhere." The crash produced physical wounds, but it was the invisible ones that lasted the longest. Families demand accountability. Families who lost loved ones voiced heartbreak and anger. Many asked, Why weren't hijacker screenings stronger? How could three men with broken bottles overpower a modern airplane? Why didn't airlines prioritize cockpit security earlier? Should authorities have intercepted the flight sooner? Ethiopian Airlines expressed deep sorrow and offered compensation. But the pain of loss echoed far beyond any financial acknowledgement. Aviation security enters a new era. Flight 961 forced aviation authorities to confront a truth. Security was a global responsibility, not a national one. New international policies emerged. Background checks strengthened, passenger profiling improved. Behavioral analysis training expanded. Cabin crew, anti-hijacking training crew were trained to identify suspicious behavior, use coded signals, form defensive positions, protect cockpit entry surveillance systems. Interior, cabin cameras were proposed to help pilots see threats behind the door. Safe landing over. Compliance pilots were encouraged to land the plane at the nearest airport, regardless of hijacker demands, a move that would later become a cornerstone of modern hijacking response. A lesson. Written in tragedy. The ditching itself became a monumental study in aviation schools. Footage recorded by beachgoers, rare and unbelievable, was used to show pilots the physics of water impact. Instructors replayed the footage frame by frame, the moment a wing touched water, the cartwheel effect, the fuselage tearing debris, scattering survivors, ejected into the sea. It was horrifying, but educational. One instructor told his class, "This video teaches in seconds what textbooks take chapters to explain." Captain Abate faces the world. Months later, Captain Abate stood before international media, humble as ever. His words became iconic. "I did not land on the ocean. The ocean took us. I only tried to guide the aircraft with the strength I had left." Reporters pressed him. "Do you consider yourself a hero?" He shook his head. "The survivors are the heroes. They fought harder than I did." His modesty only deepened the world's admiration. The legacy that lives on the final conclusion from investigators was chilling. Had the hijackers listened to the captain for even 1 minute, most of the passengers would have survived. Their ignorance doomed them. Their stubbornness killed innocence. Their delusion created one of the deadliest hijacking disasters in aviation history. But from this tragedy emerged a new foundation of safety, one that would later help prevent countless hijackings, protect passengers, and reinforce cockpit protocols that remain in place to this day. Flight 961 changed aviation forever. Yet, its story was not finished. The final chapter, the legacy, the lessons, the scars, would echo for decades to come. The waters of the Indian Ocean eventually stilled, but the memory of Ethiopian Airlines Flight 961 would never settle. The tragedy became more than a headline, more than an investigation, more than a case study in aviation manuals. It became a scar across the surface of global aviation, a reminder that the sky, for all its beauty, can become unforgiving when chaos enters the cockpit. Years after the crash, survivors still woke in the middle of the night with lungs gasping for air, hearing again the sound of tearing metal and rushing water. Families still walked along beaches thousands of miles away, imagining the impossible, that the sea could somehow return what it had taken. And pilots around the world still referenced Flight 961 when discussing the fragility of control in the face of human unpredictability. But out of the grief, something remarkable grew, a legacy that redefined safety, reshaped cockpit culture, and rewrote the very rules of aviation. The world remembers the survivors. Many survivors carried permanent injuries, broken bones, lung trauma from seawater inhalation, deep lacerations from torn metal. But the emotional wounds ran deeper than any scar. For years, some refused to fly again. Others forced themselves to board planes so they wouldn't surrender to fear. One man described his nightmares. "I hear the engines die. I see the water coming toward us, and I can't move. A woman who lost her husband in the crash said, "The ocean feels alive to me now. When I look at it, I don't see water, I see him." Yet despite the trauma, survivors formed a bond, a family forged not by blood, but by the night they fought for breath. Among shattered aircraft parts and floating debris, some visited the Comoros Islands again to thank the villagers who had risked their lives to pull strangers from the sea. Others attended memorial gatherings each year, lighting candles and whispering names into the wind. The world remembered them too. Aviation learns and changes forever. Flight 961 proved something terrifying. A hijacker doesn't need a bomb to destroy an airplane. Misunderstanding alone can kill. This realization triggered a revolution in aviation security. 1. Cockpit security becomes sacred. Airlines around the world reinforced cockpit doors, a change that would later become vital in preventing further hijackings. No longer could intruders storm the cockpit with makeshift weapons or threats. 2. Pilot authority reinforced new laws, protected a pilot's right and duty to prioritize safety over demands. Hijackers could no longer dictate routes, altitudes, or destinations. Pilots were trained. Land at the nearest airport. Do not negotiate beyond safety. 3. Crew resource management evolves. Flight 961 emphasized the importance of teamwork, even under duress. After this tragedy, CRM training expanded worldwide. Assertiveness under threat. Handling irrational hijackers, maintaining cockpit control, emergency communication strategies. Fuel awareness becomes a critical lesson. The idea that passengers could force pilots into impossible routes highlighted how little the public understood aircraft limits. Flight schools added case studies like Flight 961 to teach pilots how to assert fuel reality, even under threat. 5. International cooperation strengthens countries, improved communication regarding hijack threats, making sure no flight would go ignored or unmonitored. All because one flight proved how quickly chaos could unravel an aircraft in the sky. The captain, who refused to give up Captain Lulabat, became a symbol, not just of skill, but of courage under impossible conditions. When he shared his story years later, he didn't speak like a hero. He spoke like a man still carrying the weight of hearts that didn't return home. He once said, "I survived, but part of me stayed in that water." Pilots across the world called his ditching miraculous, textbook, impossible yet executed. He had guided a powerless 767, a massive aircraft not designed for water landings, to within sight of land, despite hijackers' interfering engines, failing no flaps, no thrust, no altitude, no time. Even as everything fell apart, he stayed in control until the last possible moment. Many survivors owe their lives to him. The haunting beauty of Comoros. On the beaches where Flight 961 fell, the ocean has long returned to quiet. Tourists walk along the shore, never knowing that the sands beneath their feet once held survivors fighting for life. Children play in waves that once carried debris. The island's simplicity masks the depth of the tragedy it witnessed. But the locals never forget. Fishermen still tell stories of the morning they pulled strangers from the sea. Elders speak of courage and chaos in equal measure. A small memorial sits quietly among palm trees, honoring lives lost. When survivors visited years later, many wept at the sight of the islanders, people who had thrown themselves into danger without hesitation. One islander said simply, "Life is precious. That day, we saved who we could." The final echo of Flight 961 aviation disasters often fade from public memory, overwhelmed by newer headlines. But Flight 961 endures, not because of its tragedy, but because of its lessons. It stands as a landmark in aviation, the most documented ditching of a wide-body jet in history, a turning point in cockpit security, a reminder of the consequences of ignorance, a tribute to courage under impossible pressure. And above all, a story of human beings fighting for life in an ocean that wanted to claim them. Families still mourn. Survivors still remember. Pilots still study. The world still learns. The Waves took Flight 961, but its legacy rises every time a plane takes off with safer skies, stronger rules, and better protections. Because the story did not end in the ocean. It became part of aviation forever.